Cascading Style Sheets, or CSS, is a W3C World Wide Web Consortium standard. It defines the presentation of the HTML document or web page. By presentation, I mean how it is displayed, how things appear, where things appear. It is a separate language with its own syntax. By syntax, I mean how the language is formed and punctuated. There were several versions of CSS in the early days of the web. The latest version is CSS Level 3. At this point, new additions to the language are being implemented as modules. So therefore, as I understand it at this point in time, we will be staying at CSS 3 and there will be no CSS 4. An overview of the web page. The HTML language or HTML elements define the structure and mark up the content. So the content is placed inside the HTML elements. CSS defines the presentation, how everything looks. I would also like to point out that we have the JavaScript language that also works with the web page, and that defines the behavior. And by behavior, I mean how the page acts, and in many instances, how it acts when the user does something, such as clicking on a button or filling out a form. The CSS code can be placed in several locations in the document. It can be placed inside the HTML element, and that is called an inline style. While that is allowed, it is not very convenient. It also can be placed inside the opening and closing style tags, which is located in the head section of the document. I always recommend developing in the head section, and then later on you can move it to an external file. External files are referenced using the link element or the @import directive. The @import directive needs to be used within the opening and closing style elements. It also can be placed in an external file, therefore an external file can call another external file. The purpose of placing your CSS into an external file is for efficiency, meaning we can reuse that file over and over again. We can link it to the different pages, and when we make a change, we only need to make that change in one location. This is the basic syntax of a CSS selector. A selector is the part of the page to which the styles are being applied. The styles are enclosed inside the curly braces, and a property is set to a value. There are many different styles that you can use to write your CSS. I recommend you choose a style that works for you and be consistent in using that style. You do not need to have spaces around the colon, but you may. You do not need to write your rules down. You may write them across. However, white space makes everything a lot easier to read and to understand. This is a very common style that most developers use. A space after the colon, and every property and value on its own line. This is an example of an embedded style. Note that the CSS code is inside the opening and closing style tags inside the head section. I would like to point out that the type attribute is no longer required in HTML5. Please note the different types of comments that you can use in the web page. There are HTML comments and there are CSS comments. Please use them in the proper places. You should be familiar with an element selector. Any HTML element can be used as a selector. Again, by a selector, I mean the part of the web page to where the style is being applied. If I were to use, for example, an H1 element as a selector, that style, all of the rules, would apply to every H1 in that page. While that may work at times, there might be times when that might not be practical. So therefore, you might need to further identify which H1 you want to apply the styles to. We have a class selector, and I have two examples of how the class selector could be used. Let's first look at the HTML code. Inside each of these three elements, I have a class attribute. That is an HTML attribute. It is set to a value. That value is the name of the class. In the CSS coding, that name of the class is preceded by a period. That is how we apply that style to the class. So that class has a specific selector. The selector begins with a period and is followed by the class name. Every place that class exists, that style will be applied. Notice again that there are two different ways of applying that class in the CSS. Dot green refers to a general class selector that can be applied in any HTML element. P.small refers to a class called small that will only work if it is a class of the P element. I would also like to point out that multiple classes can be applied to the same element, and how that is written. In the HTML, the class attribute can accept multiple values. Those values are space separated, not comma separated. The ID selector. Let's look at the HTML code here. We have two ID attributes. ID is an HTML attribute, and it is set to a value. That is the name of the ID. In the CSS code, that selector is represented by the pound sign or the hash sign in front of the value of that ID or the name of the ID. ID values must be unique in each web page, meaning if I have an ID equals my H1, I should not have a second ID equals my H1 anywhere in that page. Should you wish to repeat a style, use a class. IDs are meant for unique instances, specific unique sections of the web page. In CSS, we have the phrase combinators. Combinators refer to multiple selectors, and they also explain a relationship between selectors. There are several types of combinators that we will be looking at. You will be familiar with the Descendants selector. You may not be familiar with the others. We have a child selector, an adjacent sibling selector, and a general sibling selector. In HTML, we have a parent-child relationship based on the structure of the HTML elements. All of the elements are inside the body, so therefore the body is the main parent. Any element that contains other elements will also have a child-parent relationship. I would like to point out that every element in the HTML document has a parent. We also have sibling relationships. If a parent contains several elements, those elements would be siblings, very similar to an ancestral tree. Here we have a Descendants selector, section space H2. If you look at the HTML code, you see that the section element contains an H2 element and a P element. The H2 and the P are children of section. Section is their parent. Now, section is inside the body, so obviously at some point body is a parent of section, or section could be somewhere else with a different parent. It really doesn't matter because what we're doing is looking at this specific area. Because H2 and P are essentially on the same level inside the section element, not only are they children, but they are also siblings. If we look at the CSS Selector, section space H2, what that is saying, and you really want to read it from right to left, it is saying the H2 element that is inside a section, the H2 element that is a descendant of section. Yes, it is a child. However, it is also a descendant. This selector does not necessarily specify that it has to be a child. All it says is that it has to be a descendant. Now, the rule is applied to the H2. It is not applied to the section. It is not applied to both of them. It is applied to the H2. This is a descendant selector. There are many variations in which we can construct a descendant selector. Remember, a descendant is a parent-child relationship. It also could be a parent-grandchild relationship. Let's take a look at our HTML. Here we have a section element that contains our H2 element and our P element. The P element contains an EM element. The EM is a child of P. P is a child of section. H2 and P are siblings. Technically, EM is a grandchild of section, although we don't have grandchild selectors. We only have child selectors. EM is not a child of section. EM is a child of P. However, we can still use those relationships to devise a selector for purposes of applying a style to a specific part of the page. So here we have #XYZ space H2. So where is that selector? Again, we read from the right to the left. The H2 that is a descendant of #XYZ. Well, we see in section, we see that the section element has an ID attribute set to XYZ. And since IDs are unique, we know that this is the only area in the web page where this H2 is going to be relevant. This style will be applied to any H2 that is a descendant of ID equals XYZ. Let's take a look at the next selector. .abc space P space EM. Again, we read from right to left. This says, apply the style to the EM that is a descendant of P that is a descendant of the class ABC. Well, we know that classes can be used in multiple locations. In the example here, in the section element, we also have a class attribute, class equals ABC. So that is referencing this section. Inside that section, we have the paragraph, and that paragraph has an EM child. So the style will be applied to the text inside the EM. A child selector is represented by the greater than sign. A child is also referred to as a direct descendant. Remember, they're all descendants, but a child is a direct descendant. So if we look at the CSS code, we see #XYZ greater than P. Again, reading from right to left, that says that we will apply the style to the P that is a child of ID equals XYZ. If we look at our HTML, we see the section ID equals XYZ. There are several P's inside here, but only one is a child. The other is technically a grandchild. It's still a descendant, however, it is not a child. So the style will only be applied to the P that is underneath the H2. If we contrast this rule to the rule underneath section space P, that is just a general descendant selector. That style will be applied to any P that is a descendant of section. So here we see our section element has a P child and also a P grandchild. That rule will be applied to both of those P's because they are descendants of section. The adjacent sibling selector refers to the first sibling of a given selector. Looking at the first CSS rule, reading from right to left, the P that is an adjacent sibling of an H2. If we look at the HTML code, we are looking at the P that is an adjacent or next to sibling. And because the web page reads from the top to down, we start at the H2, and then we find the adjacent sibling that is underneath it. The general sibling selector will match all siblings. So here we have H2, and that is a tilde P, meaning every P that is a sibling of H2. So here in our HTML code, we have two P's that are siblings of H2. There is another P that is a child of div that is not a sibling of H2.